The cursor blinked, unwavering. Hypnotic, a tiny digital soldier awaiting the final command on my laptop screen. The hotel room was impersonal, smelling of disinfectant and lives that had passed through too quickly, just like mine. Outside, the city pulsed, oblivious to the earthquake I was about to trigger with a single click. My hands were steady on the keyboard, my heart, a drum beating a slow, constant rhythm. People imagine revenge as an explosive act, a scream of fury. Mine wasn't. Mine was planned in the silence of late nights, fueled by bitter coffee and a clarity that only absolute despair can provide. It was surgical. My finger moved, pressed down, click. The sound was almost inaudible, but to me it echoed like the closing of a vault door. It was done. The website was live. The recordings, the transcripts, the evidence. Her voice, Catherine's, in all its cruel, manipulative glory, now exposed to the world in conversations she thought were whispered in the safety of her fortress. At this very moment, I know the phones of the board members are vibrating. Catherine's reputation, polished with gentle smiles and a ravenous ambition, is beginning to fracture. They will call me a traitor, disloyal, insane. They will say I destroyed the career of the most admired woman in our industry. They have no idea I didn't destroy anything. I just showed them the receipt for the destruction she had already wrought upon my life, and this was the only way to stop her from creating her next victim. This is just the tip of the iceberg, to discover the shocking truth behind my story, and not miss the verdict. Subscribe now, and hit the notification bell. The story they will write about me is simple, almost a corporate fable. Grace, the assistant who couldn't accept her limits, the mediocre professional who, eaten by envy, tried to bring down the mentor who once gave her a chance. It's a clean narrative, easy to digest, and Catherine was a master at creating characters. Mine was her masterpiece. She cast me in the role of the emotionally unstable, the one who was too intense. They were small doses of poison, administered with a smile, a look of feigned concern shared with the director when I was working late. "Grace gives so much of herself, I worry she's heading for a burnout," she would say, her voice as smooth as velvet, offering a care that was, in fact, a sentence, a way to invalidate any future complaint I might have. After all, who would believe the word of a woman on the verge of a nervous breakdown? What they never saw, what no one in those air-conditioned boardrooms with gourmet coffee could ever imagine, was the backstage of this theater. My supposed instability was, in fact, the true cost of Catherine's success. It was my sleepless nights, buried in spreadsheets and reports that would bear her signature the next day. It was the stress-induced gastritis that flared violently before every presentation I spent all night creating, so she could perform with a brilliance that wasn't hers. I vividly remember my mother's 60th birthday party. The whole family gathered, and me, locked in an empty office 200 miles away, redoing an entire proposal because Catherine had forgotten a crucial detail. I watched them sing Happy Birthday through the cold, pixelated screen of a video call. The loneliness of that moment, the echo of my own voice singing to an image, was the symbol of my devotion. The next day, she thanked me with a coffee and a pat on the shoulder. "You always save me, Grace." A week later, I overheard her in the hallway telling a vice president how she had pulled an all-nighter, alone, to save the contract. My crime, I admit, wasn't being weak. It was being blind. I confused the admiration I felt for her with a servile devotion. I didn't want Catherine's job. I desperately craved her nod of approval. Every good work whispered in the hallway, every quiet compliment, was my drug, my trophy. I contented myself with the crumbs of recognition that fell from her bountiful table. I allowed her to define me. I handed her the pen to write my story, and she used it with the precision of an executioner to turn me into a footnote, a disposable addendum to her own glorious biography. For years, I accepted the role. I smiled, I thanked her, I swallowed my tears in frustration. They grew accustomed to my silence. They mistook my resilience for passivity, my loyalty for submission. They thought that by discarding me, they were simply turning the final page. But what they, and especially Catherine, were about to discover was that this wasn't the end. It was the prologue. The woman they had humiliated was dead and buried, and in her place, the author of the only version that mattered now was born, mine. And this time, I wouldn't be asking for permission to be heard. But this woman who hit publish in an anonymous hotel room wasn't born of hatred. She wasn't forged by revenge, not in her essence. She was the inevitable consequence of a much older, much deeper desire. A desire that, for years, I had treated as a crime, as a shameful character flaw. I just wanted the truth to prevail, Not my truth, selfish and personal, but the truth, the intrinsic truth of a well-executed project. The elegant logic of a sound argument, the functional beauty of a creative solution. My purest pleasure was never in the applause. It was in the silent architecture that preceded it, in the thrill of spending nights awake, fueled by caffeine, connecting dots no one else could see, and the next morning, handing Catherine not just a report, but a complete treasure map. I was the foundation engineer, the invisible worker who ensured the skyscraper wouldn't collapse. And for a long time, that was enough for me. I convinced myself that this was the natural order of things. The corporate world, after all, doesn't celebrate the one who lays the bricks. It erects statues to the conqueror, who plants the flag at the top. Any pang of resentment I felt seeing Catherine present my words, my strategies, as if they had sprung from her own mind, was immediately crushed by a wave of guilt. That's envy, Grace, I would tell myself, silently lashing myself in my cubicle. Be grateful for the opportunity. I felt dirty for wanting more, for feeling a void when the accolades went to her. It was the primitive human longing to be seen. But I was conditioned to believe that, for a woman in my position, that longing was a sin of arrogance. This latent desire, dormant under layers of guilt, began to transform into an urgent need with Project Aegis. It was my most ambitious work, a new crisis management methodology I had developed in my spare time, on coffee shop napkins and clandestine spreadsheets on my personal laptop. It was a complex but robust system that could save the company millions, and, more importantly, protect the brand's reputation in an age of disinformation. I presented it to Catherine in her office, my heart in my throat, hoping, for the first time, for not just approval, but the acknowledgement of a partnership. She listened, took notes, and said her favorite line, "I'll look it over, sweetie. It's promising." 2 weeks later, Aegis was reborn in a presentation to the board with a new name, the Catherine Protocol. It was my work, my slides with a new design, my words, polished with her vocabulary, my research, condensed into graphs I myself had created. But she made one subtle, catastrophic change. She removed all the safeguards, the safety brakes I had designed to ensure the process remained ethical and stable. She turned it into a more aggressive, faster tool, with more impressive short-term results on paper. She didn't just steal my idea. She perverted it, emptied it of its soul, its prudence. This time I didn't stay silent. I confronted her, not with the fury of someone who'd been robbed, but with the technical concern of a creator watching her invention being used irresponsibly. Catherine, without the safety nets, the protocol is unstable. We could cause far more reputational damage than what we're trying to prevent. It's a game of Russian roulette with client trust. I remember her smile. It wasn't a sneer, but something worse. A smile of amused condescension, like an adult listening to a naive child. She leaned over her mahogany desk, the jangle of her gold bracelets echoing in the silent office. "Grace, darling," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You are absolutely brilliant at creating the tools, the best I've ever seen. But leave the strategy to those who know how to actually play the game." In that instant, something shifted. Her words weren't a compliment. They were a cage. She was telling me my place was in the engine room, never on the bridge. My passive desire for recognition died right there. In its place, a mission was born, an undeniable need to protect the truth about my work, about my competence, and above all, the truth about the charismatic fraud that was Catherine. I started documenting everything, saving original versions of files, printing important emails, recording audio from meetings for my personal notes. I was building a dossier, an Ark of the Covenant for my truth. But Catherine was a queen in her castle. She controlled every bridge, every guard, every narrative. For my truth to surface, I would need to find a crack in her impenetrable wall. And I had no idea yet just how brutally she would react upon realizing there was a spy within her walls. The weeks following our confrontation were a silent chess match, played out in hallways and between the lines of emails. I moved my pieces in the dark, saving files, creating backups on personal drives, documenting every inconsistency, every lie. Catherine, in turn, moved hers under the blinding glare of the spotlight, and, to my growing dread, she became kind. Praise in meetings I wasn't even invited to anymore. Invitations for coffee that I declined with flimsy excuses. a sudden interest in my personal life. It was the spider's tactic, weaving a web of silk and kindness around the fly before the strike. She wasn't forgiving me. She was measuring me for a coffin. The time bomb I had warned about, the Catherine protocol without my safeguards, finally exploded. And the explosion was nuclear. The Althea Group, our biggest client, one of the oldest and most profitable accounts in the firm, used the protocol during an image crisis. Without the ethical breaks I had designed, the strategy proved aggressive and disastrous. The crisis wasn't contained. It was amplified to catastrophic levels. The media crucified them. The client's stock plummeted. And our company's name, once synonymous with excellence, was now associated with predatory and reckless practices. Millions in losses, a broken contract, and our reputation in tatters. The next morning, I was summoned to the president's office. My stomach was a block of ice, but a part of me, a naive and desperate part, felt a spark of vindication. This is it. They'll finally see. Catherine called me in so I could explain what went wrong, to show them my warnings, my emails. The room was full. The entire board, the company lawyers. Catherine sat next to the CEO, her face a mask of controlled devastation. She looked like a queen whose kingdom had been attacked. Then, she began to speak, her voice cracking, the performance of a betrayed leader. And on the screen, she projected a series of emails. Emails I had never written. An entire, meticulously forged correspondence. In it, my email signature instructed the client's team to ignore the protocol's original safety locks, assuring them the optimized version was more effective. There was even an exchange where Catherine, in her infinite wisdom, warned me of the dangers, and my forged self replied with an arrogance I didn't possess, saying I had it all under control and that she needed to trust me. The sound of the world faded away. It was my name up there, my profile picture, but they weren't my words. It was fiction, a masterpiece of betrayal, painted with the ink of my career. I opened my mouth to protest, to scream, but all that came out was a gasp of air. That's not... Catherine cut me off, her eyes full of a plastic, rehearsed pain. I trusted you, Grace. I gave you every opportunity, and you sabotaged this company. You destroyed us. I was fired on the spot. For cause, gross negligence and corporate sabotage. I was told I should consider myself lucky they weren't pressing criminal charges. A security guard escorted me to my desk, watching as I, trembling, threw the remains of 10 years of dedication into a cardboard box. Every glance in the hallway was a dagger of contempt or pity. In less than 10 minutes, I had gone from a respected professional to a pariah, a criminal. Catherine's checkmate hadn't just been about beating me. It had been about annihilating me. That night, in my apartment, the silence was a physical assailant. How could I fight digital evidence? It was my word against a corporate goddess and her fabricated dossier. My career wasn't over. It had been murdered. I picked up the company tablet from my bag, the last link to that world, to wipe my files before sending it back via courier. My fingers moved on autopilot, deleting photos, contacts, memories. I opened the voice recorder app to clear the notes I used to make. There was a file I didn't recognize. The title was Pre-Aegis Meeting. The date was from months ago. It was 3 hours and 15 minutes long. I remembered the meeting. It had lasted an hour. By some stupid mistake, I must have left the recorder running in my coat pocket afterwards. I put in my earbuds, more out of inertia than hope. I heard my own voice, nervous, passionate, pitching the idea to Catherine. I heard her voice, full of empty praise and false promises. I heard the meeting end, the sound of the door closing. And then, the recording continued, silence for a moment. And then, I heard Catherine's voice again, but in a tone I had never heard before. Icy, smug, cruel. She wasn't alone. Someone else had entered the room, and the words Catherine said next weren't just my salvation. They were her death sentence. Catherine's voice on the recording was silk and venom, a cocktail I had been drinking for years without realizing it. She's a loyal workhorse, I heard Catherine say to her mysterious guest, the voice crystal clear through my earbuds. Brilliant, tireless, but a workhorse nonetheless, and workhorses don't get a seat at the banquet table. You just throw them a bone afterwards. The air rushed out of my lungs in a hiss. The earbuds seemed to freeze in my ears, her voice becoming a distant metallic echo. And the memory came, not as a fleeting thought, but as a physical assault, a wave of nausea and shame that threw me back in time. The memory of the banquet, the day Catherine showed me, in front of 200 people, that I was nothing more than a bone to be gnawed on and discarded. It was the quarterly launch for investors and the trade press, the biggest event on our corporate calendar. The grand ballroom of the city's most expensive hotel was packed, the cream of the financial market, renowned journalists, all there, waiting for our company's next big move. And the big move was mine. I was in the third row, an anonymous dot swallowed by the vastness of the audience, but my heart was pounding in my throat. My palms were slick with cold sweat, crushing a program I wasn't even reading. On the giant screen, suspended over the stage like an altar, were my slides, my design, my research, my Project Aegis, which the world would now know by the gleaming name of the Catherine Protocol. Catherine on stage was a force of nature. She didn't just present, she mesmerized. Bathed in the white light of a spotlight, she moved with the grace of a dancer and the authority of a general. Every word that left her mouth, every dramatic pause, every calculated smile, was a note in a symphony of persuasion. And the words, the notes, were mine. I recognized them the way a mother recognizes her own child's cry in a crowded nursery. She spoke of her inspiration during a rainy dawn, of her weeks of exhaustive research, of her conclusions. And the audience devoured her with their eyes, hypnotized. I felt torn in two. One part of me, the creator, exulted at seeing the undeniable power of my creation. The other part, the woman, felt violated, watching my soul being worn like a couture gown by an imposter. Then, the crucial moment, the Q&A session. Julian Croft, an analyst from Axial Bank, a man feared for his sharp mind and cutting questions, raised his hand. He went straight for the project's most sensitive point, one of the complex safeguards I had created, which Catherine, in her simplified and more marketable version, had removed. He questioned the protocol's sustainability without that pillar. The room, once buzzing with admiring whispers, fell into a dense silence. I saw, from my seat, a flash of panic in Catherine's eyes, almost imperceptible. She didn't know the answer, not the deep answer, the answer that lived in the marrow of the project. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. A universe of possibilities passed in that glance. She could have said, "I have a brilliant mind on my team who developed that component, and I'd like to call her up to explain." It would have been my crowning moment. But Catherine didn't build her empire on the merits of others. She built it on the erasure of others. She smiled, a wide, maternal, terribly condescending smile, and she pointed in my direction. The beam of a follow spot found me in the audience, blinding me. "What an excellent question, Julian," she said, her voice projecting throughout the auditorium. "And it just shows how detailed and deep our development team is. I have with me right here, Grace, a brilliant junior analyst who gave me some fundamental operational support on the data gathering side. Grace, darling, why don't you come up here and explain to Julian, in simple terms, the function of that safety lock that we, together, decided to remove for being a bit redundant for the client's objectives?" The world stopped. Junior analyst, support on the data side, simple terms, we decided together, redundant. Every word was a nail being hammered into the lid of my professional coffin. She wasn't giving me an opportunity. She was putting me in a tiny box and showing me off to the audience like a trained pet who knows a cute trick. She needed me to escape a trap, but she would do it in a way that would diminish me forever. I stood up, my legs feeling like cotton. I walked to the microphone an assistant handed me, feeling 200 pairs of eyes analyzing me, judging me through the lens Catherine had just created for me, and I answered. I answered with the precision and passion of someone who knew every algorithm, every line of code, every risk scenario of that project. I explained the complex interplay of variables, the necessity of the safeguard as an ethical, not just technical pillar. When I finished, a silence of genuine admiration hung in the air for a second. Julian Croft himself nodded his head, visibly impressed, but before I could even take a breath, Catherine was beside me, her arm around my shoulders, taking back the main microphone. "Marvelous, isn't she?" she said to the audience, like a proud circus owner with her main attraction. "This is why I always say, our company's greatest asset is investing in our base. Raw talent like this, with the right mentorship, the sky's the limit. Thank you for your contribution, Grace. You can sit down now." And with that, she turned to the next question, discarding me like a used napkin. I wasn't the author. I was the raw talent, the raw material, the living proof of her genius as a mentor. As I walked back to my seat, invisible once more, The only thing I could hear in my head was the sound of my spirit shattering. I don't remember the rest of the presentation. I don't remember the deafening applause for Catherine, nor her final speech, full of false modesty. The moment I sat back down in my chair, in the third row, was the moment the world turned into a silent film, projected in slow motion. I saw mouths moving, but I heard no sounds. I saw people smiling and gesturing, but I felt none of their energy. The pain was so sharp, so absolute, that it had transcended itself, becoming an absence of everything, a cold, silent vacuum, where, moments before, there had been a career, an identity, a shred of hope. I was a ghost watching a party to which I was not only uninvited, but for which I had also served as the doormat for the host. Then came the cocktail reception, hell in the form of salmon canapes and glasses of champagne. I was forced to stay, to smile, to circulate. It was part of the protocol, and it was perhaps the cruelest part. People came up to me, the same people who had witnessed my public annihilation, and said things with a nauseating compassion. "Congratulations on your part. You were great. Catherine is so lucky to have you on her team." Every congratulations was a veiled insult. Every sympathetic smile, a stab of pity. They didn't see me as a colleague, but as the poor thing, the victim who needed a pat on the head. Across the ballroom, Catherine was a sun, the center of a galaxy of directors and investors who orbited around her, laughing loudly at her jokes, toasting to her resounding success. Occasionally, her gaze would meet mine over the crowd, and she would give me a conspiratorial wink, the gesture of an owner to her trained dog who had performed its trick well, and I would smile back, a smile that didn't reach my eyes, a smile that was pure ground glass. The taxi ride home was the first crack in my icy armor. I pressed my forehead against the cold window and watched the city lights streak by like colored blurs, each one a silent witness to my humiliation. It was there, in the anonymity of the back seat, that the rage began to bubble, hot and bitter, in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't an explosive red rage. It was a cold, dark, heavy rage. The rage of someone who has been deceived for too long, especially by herself. The rage of someone who finally realizes the game was rigged from the start, and she was the only one who didn't know. I walked into my apartment, and the silence hit me like a punch to the chest. There were no distractions, nowhere to run. There, in the solitude of my sanctuary, the dam finally broke. But it wasn't tears of sadness that came. It was something else entirely. I stopped in front of the hallway mirror and stared at the woman looking back at me. The pale face, the sunken, shining eyes of an internal fever, the mouth set in a thin line of restraint. I saw the junior analyst. I saw the raw talent. I saw the woman who stayed up all night so another could shine. And for the first time, I felt a deep disgust. A disgust for my own passivity, for my childish thirst for approval. The humiliation Catherine had inflicted on me was public and devastating, but the greatest humiliation, the most lasting one, was the one I had allowed, day after day, in silence. Pain has this strange power. When it's deep enough, it burns away everything that isn't essential. And what was left, in the ashes of that humiliated grace, was a brutal and uncomfortable clarity. I finally understood. The game wasn't about merit. It never was. It was about power. Catherine wasn't a mentor. She was an alpha predator. She didn't see me as an ally, but as a valuable and dangerous resource. A resource to be exploited to exhaustion and then neutralized. Mentorship was just the name she gave the golden cage, where she kept me productive and controlled. In that moment, facing my own reflection, the sadness drained away completely. It was replaced by something solid, heavy, and incredibly calm. An anvil of determination settled deep in my soul. I no longer wanted Catherine's approval. I no longer wanted a seat at her table. I wanted the truth, the naked, raw, undeniable truth. And I understood, with a certainty that sent a shiver down my spine, that the truth would not be given to me. The truth, like power, had to be taken. I turned away from the mirror. There were no more tears to cry. The broken woman who had entered that apartment no longer existed. I didn't spend the rest of the night mourning what I had lost. I spent it awake, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and a blank notebook. The pain didn't drown me. It baptized me in fire. That night, the loyal employee died, and in her place, the strategist was born. I didn't cry. I began to plan. This pain of humiliation made me feel so alone. If my story is resonating with you, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I read and reply to all of them. The sun that streamed through my window the next morning did not illuminate the same woman who had arrived shattered the night before. The mourning for my old identity was over. What remained was a cold, sharp, and crystalline purpose. My morning ritual, once an automatic act, became deliberate. The coffee, black and bitter, wasn't to wake me up, but to focus me. The choice of clothes, a sober and impeccable suit, wasn't to please or to blend into the corporate landscape. It was armor. I was no longer dressing for work. I was preparing for war. The notebook I had scribbled in during the night didn't contain a plan for passionate revenge, full of rage and immediate retaliation. That would be Catherine's game, not mine. What I created was a map, a detailed map of her empire, her routines, her closest allies, her known weaknesses, her secret vices, the 3 o'clock coffee with the marketing director, her need to be the center of every conversation, her vanity. I realized I couldn't defeat her in a frontal battle, where she was the queen and owned all the pieces. I would have to become a shadow, a ghost within the machine I myself had helped build. My revenge would not be a scream. It would be a whisper in the right ear. A piece moved in the dark, a slow-acting poison. My first step was digital warfare. If Catherine could forge emails, I needed an arsenal that was irrefutable. I created triple backups of all my work files, the originals, uncorrupted by her touch, on multiple thumb drives and encrypted cloud accounts, each with passwords that were anagrams of phrases about betrayal. I bought a new phone, an anonymous prepaid number, and a voice recorder as small as my thumbnail. I was building my own intelligence service with an analyst's budget and the determination of a besieged nation. The second phase of the plan was social engineering. Catherine ruled over the directors and managers with a mix of charisma and fear, but she forgot about the invisible ones, those she considered part of the furniture. And it was with them that the real power lay, the power of information. I started having lunch with the guy from IT, Ben, a computer genius whom Catherine had humiliated in a meeting for not being able to fix a problem on her Mac in under 30 seconds. I started having coffee with the assistant from the floor below, a young woman who trembled whenever Catherine walked by, ever since the day she was viciously reprimanded for bringing the wrong coffee. I didn't ask for anything directly. I didn't turn them into accomplices. I just listened. I collected their stories, their grievances, and amidst their frustrations, I found Catherine's patterns of behavior, her lies, the small cracks in her perfect facade. The golden opportunity for my first offensive move came with the annual budget review meeting. It was the most secret meeting of the semester, behind closed doors, involving only Catherine and the heads of each department. It was there that true alliances were forged and betrayals were planned. The main conference room on the top floor was always prepared the night before. I used the excuse of needing to finish an urgent report and stayed late. The office was deserted, bathed in twilight and the hum of sleeping computers. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I went up to the top floor. My hands, which hours before had trembled with humiliation, were now the steady hands of a bomb disposal expert. The recorder was tiny, black, almost invisible. I slipped under the heavy mahogany table, in the exact spot where I knew Catherine always sat, and fixed it with a piece of black double-sided tape I had brought from home. The soft click of the record button was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Every step out of that room, every subtle creak of the wooden floor, was a screaming alarm in my head. The walk to the elevator was the longest and loneliest of my life. I was no longer Grace. I was a spy in enemy territory. Retrieving the device the next day was even more stressful. I had to wait for lunchtime when the room was empty. I created a diversion in the hallway, intentionally dropping a stack of papers to draw the attention of the only secretary at her desk. I went in, grabbed the recorder, and was out in less than 20 seconds. That night, at home, with the lights off and the earbuds pressed against my ears, I listened. I listened to the entire meeting. I heard Catherine lie shamelessly about numbers. I heard her inflate her department's results while subtly sabotaging a rival's budget. I heard her mock a manager behind his back, minutes after praising him for his dedication. And then, I heard something that made my blood run cold. She was talking to the CFO about the Catherine protocol and the risk with the Althea group. And she said, her voice casual and cold, "I know it's a high-risk bet, but my performance bonus depends on it. Worst-case scenario, if it blows up, I have the perfect scapegoat ready. Grace. She's emotional, Everyone knows it. No one will question it. She hadn't just humiliated me. She had been planning my destruction, coldly and methodically, for weeks. That recording was no longer proof of her fraud. It was proof of her premeditation, the confirmation that my future professional assassination wouldn't be an accident, but a contingency plan. The game had changed. I was no longer just collecting evidence to defend myself against an injustice. I now held a loaded weapon, and my patience for waiting for the right moment to use it was growing dangerously thin. Sleeping with Catherine's recording in my possession was like sleeping with a grenade under my pillow. I woke up the next morning, and the world looked different. The fear from the night before, the dread of being discovered, and the adrenaline of espionage had dissipated. In their place remained a kind of dangerous calm, a cold, settled certainty. The weapon was loaded and in my hands. Now it was just a matter of choosing the time and the target. At the office, my posture changed. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible to most. But to an attentive predator like Catherine, it was an earthquake. I stopped hiding. I stopped using alternate hallways to avoid an encounter. I stopped looking away when I crossed paths with her. Instead, I met her gaze, just for a second or two longer than was socially acceptable, without a hint of a smile, without any obvious hostility, just observation. Like a biologist observing a fascinating and lethal specimen through a pane of containment glass. The first time she felt the change was near the coffee machine. She approached with her queenly walk, her smile perfectly calibrated. "Grace, dear, you look rested," she said, her voice full of that false sweetness that once would have made me shrink. "I'm glad you're taking better care of yourself. We wouldn't want another episode of stress from overwork, would we?" It was a veiled reference to my supposed instability, a verbal barb disguised as concern. The old Grace would have blushed, stammered an excuse, but the new Grace simply turned slowly, picked up her cup. I looked her directly in the eye, a level gaze, no submission. "I'm fine, Catherine. I slept very well. Thank you for asking." It's amazing how a good night's sleep can bring such immense clarity, don't you think? You start to hear things completely differently. I let the word "hear" hang in the air between us like an invisible threat, and walked away, not waiting for a response. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her smile falter for a split second, the first crack in the armor. In the meetings that followed, my behavior transformed. Before, I was the active participant, the solution provider, the first to speak to complement Catherine's ideas or solve a problem. Now, I was a sphinx. I sat at the corner of the table, silent, just watching. My eyes went from Catherine to the other managers, mapping the power dynamics, the fragile alliances, the small, silent betrayals. I no longer jotted down meeting topics in my notebook. I drew an organizational chart of loyalty and fear. Catherine started to notice. I would catch her casting furtive glances my way, trying to decipher my silence. My silence, which was once the comfortable sound of my submission, had now become a blank canvas onto which she inevitably projected her own fears and guilty conscience. Silence isn't always consent. Sometimes, the silent one is just listening more carefully. I decided to increase the psychological pressure. I used one of my pawns. I asked Ben, the helpful and underestimated guy from IT, for a favor. "Ben, could you possibly retrieve the beta version of the Project Aegis presentation from an old server backup from a few months back?" I accidentally deleted my copy. "It's just for personal reference," I said, with all the nonchalance I could muster. I knew perfectly well that a request to access such an old and sensitive file for a project that had been publicly credited to Catherine would generate a security alert that would land on her desk in less than an hour. And it did. Late that afternoon, her assistant called me. "Catherine wants to see you, in her office. Now." The door closed behind me with a soft click. The air in the room felt thicker. "Grace, have a seat," she said, without even looking up from her computer. The pause stretched on. "I heard you've been looking for the old Aegis files. May I ask why?" She tried to keep her tone casual, but her fingers drumming lightly on the mahogany desk betrayed her. "I was just curious about the project's evolution, Catherine," I replied, my voice calm, my body relaxed in the chair. "I find it fascinating to see how an initial idea, some raw talent, transforms into something so grand and strategic. It's inspiring to see the whole process, especially the decisions that are made along the way, what's kept, what's discarded, and the reasons behind each choice." Her drumming fingers stopped. She finally looked at me. The air in the room grew heavy, electric. She stared at me, searching for the old Grace. the frightened employee who would stammer, who would apologize for causing any trouble, but she didn't find her. In her place was this new version, calm, impassive, almost bored. For the first time in all the years I had known her, I saw something in Catherine's face that wasn't power, or contempt, or false sympathy. It was a shadow of uncertainty, of fear. The hunter was, for the first time, smelling a trap. I left her office knowing I had won that battle. I hadn't shown my weapon, only its shadow on the wall. In the days that followed, the change in Catherine was visible to anyone who knew where to look. She became more erratic, more controlling, her perfect confidence now cracked by a growing paranoia. She watched me as much as I watched her. The chess game was in its final moves, and the pieces were being silently placed in position for the final blow. They had grown accustomed to my silence, thinking it was resignation, the mourning of defeat. They had no idea it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the quiet of the eye of the hurricane, the moment of absolute sinister calm before the storm I was about to summon to destroy, piece by piece, everything she had built upon my ruins. Every storm needs a trigger, a low-pressure point, a confluence of warm and cold winds, a moment of instability that allows chaos to set in. My storm, planned in the darkness of my apartment and the solitude of sleepless nights, had a scheduled date and time: 10 a.m., September 18th, the day of the annual shareholders' convention, Catherine's grandest stage, the day she would present herself to the world not as an executive, but as a visionary, the savior who, with courage and regret, had identified and removed an internal threat, me, and put the company back on the path of prosperity and ethics. The irony was so thick I could almost choke on it. I wasn't there, of course. The pariah, the saboteur, the figure tarnished by failure, would not be invited to the Queen's coronation. My viewing box was a cheap hotel room on the other side of town, with a depressing view of a brick alleyway. My private audience consisted of 3 laptop screens open on the bed's threadbare quilt. The first was broadcasting the official, high-definition live stream of the event. On it, I saw the luxury, the smiling faces, the stage that looked like an altar. The second was monitoring the company's internal network, an admin access that my friend from IT, Ben, had forgotten to revoke from my old login. It was my back door. The third screen, the central one, was my Canon, the simple interface of a website I had spent the last few weeks building, night after night. Its working title was Project Truth, and it was one click away from going live. Catherine took the stage to a wave of warm applause. She was radiant, dressed in an impeccable white suit, the personification of purity and power. Her voice, calm and steady, resonated through the auditorium, speaking of integrity, of transparency, of how difficult decisions, however painful, were necessary to protect the future and the soul of the company. She was talking about me. Every word was a polished lie, a layer of varnish over the crime she had committed, and with each word she spoke, my finger moved closer to the mouse, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. I didn't feel anger. I felt the absolute focus of a sniper who had waited for hours in the perfect position, the target finally in their sights. The climax of her speech, I knew, would be the presentation of a video, a corporate short film about the company's bright future, full of inspiring images and uplifting music. I had watched the technical rehearsal through my back door. I knew the script by heart. There was an exact second between the end of the video and the appearance of the company logo, when the screen would go black, a 1.5-second transition. That was my window of opportunity. The video began. Catherine smiled, watching her own triumph. I positioned the cursor over the execute script button. Cold sweat trickled down my spine. One mistake, 1 millisecond of delay, and everything would be lost. The video ended. The screen went black. I clicked. In the auditorium, instead of the company logo, what appeared on the 60-foot screen behind Catherine was something different, something impossible. A gigantic, stark white QR code on a black background, and above it, in sober capital letters, a title that hung in the shocked silence of the audience. The truth demands to be heard. Scan here to be part of it. The silence on the live stream was so profound I could hear my own breathing in the hotel room. This silence lasted for 3, maybe 4 seconds. It was followed by a confused murmur that quickly grew in volume. I saw, through the panoramic camera, people looking at each other, pulling out their phones. I saw the tech crew backstage gesturing in a panic, and I saw the exact moment when Catherine, the smile still frozen on her face, turned slowly to face the screen. I saw the color drain from her face, the mask of control shattering in real time. She tried to laugh, to turn to the audience to say something about a technical glitch, but her voice wouldn't come out. The microphone only picked up a gasp of air. The website the code led to was my masterpiece. It was clean, professional, ruthlessly organized. On the homepage, there were no accusations, just an audio player with a simple title, "The Meeting That Should Never Have Been Recorded." It was the tablet recording, in its entirety. Catherine's confession about having a scapegoat. Below the player, the full transcript, with the voices identified. And further down, a series of tabs. The original Project Aegis. Relevant emails. Budget inconsistencies. It was a dossier. Cold, factual, and irrefutable. And at the top of the page, like a preface, was a note from me. Not an attack, but a declaration of principles. My name is Grace. For 10 years, I dedicated my life to this company. I was accused, fired, and publicly silenced to hide the truth you will find on this website. This is not revenge. It is a final act of loyalty to the truth and to all my colleagues who, like me, believed in an ideal that was betrayed. I ask you to listen and to decide for yourselves. I wasn't the crazy, unstable one. I was the calm, methodical narrator of my own annihilation. I had anticipated Catherine's first reaction, to order the screen's feed to be cut, and at the exact moment the image vanished, replaced by a static company logo. The second phase of my plan was activated. A second script triggered an email with the link to the Project Truth website, sent simultaneously to the list of all company employees, to the press contact list I had copied months before, and to the LinkedIn profiles of every board member and major shareholder present in that auditorium. There was no containing the leak. The dam had burst in 1,000 places at once. The livestream camera remained focused on Catherine, paralyzed on stage. And then, the sound began, quietly at first. A phone in the front row, then another. Someone had pressed play, and Catherine's voice, the voice from the recording, began to leak into the auditorium. "I have the perfect scapegoat ready. Grace, she's emotional. Everyone knows it." The checkmate wasn't the QR code on the screen. It was the sound of her own voice, her secret voice, her cruel voice, echoing from hundreds of cell phones, surrounding her, drowning her in her own betrayal. She was cornered, not by me, but by herself. From my hotel room, the sound leaking from the live stream was the purest, most chaotic symphony of justice. Catherine's recorded voice, multiplied by hundreds of phone speakers, overlapped, creating distorted echoes, transforming her cruel words into a ghostly chant that haunted her on her own stage. It was a cacophony of truth, the sound of an empire crumbling, not with the blast of a bomb, but with the insistent whisper of a reality that refused to stay buried. The murmurs in the audience turned into audible conversations, then into exclamations of shock. The event was over. The trial had begun. On the screen, the main camera, with an almost poetic televisual cruelty, held its focus on Catherine. The close-up of her face was a masterpiece of human disintegration. The mask of the serene leader, the unshakable executive, didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing what lay beneath: pure, ugly, uncontrolled panic. Her eyes, once beacons of confidence and authority, were now pits of terror, darting from side to side, searching for an escape route, an ally, an explanation that didn't exist. Her perfectly made-up mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no coherent sound came out. She was a statue of herself, melting under the hot lights of the stage she loved so much. For a moment, she raised a hand to her ear, as if to rip out her earpiece, as if the voice haunting her came from an external command, and not from within her own history. It was the gesture of someone completely lost, disconnected from reality. My gaze drifted to the camera showing the front row, the snake pit. The CEO, the man who had fired me with a look of contempt and a speech about integrity, was now pale as wax, his hand covering his mouth as he stared at his phone screen as if it were a venomous snake. The CFO, the man whose complicit laugh I had heard on the recording, looked as if he had aged 10 years in 30 seconds. I saw him jump to his feet, nearly knocking over his chair, and hurry off to the side of the stage, his head bowed, the very picture of cowardice. Catherine's allies didn't run to the stage to help her. They moved away. They created physical and metaphorical distance. Their faces were a fascinating mix of shock, and a cold, immediate calculation of self-preservation. Their loyalty, I realized with a sharp clarity, was never to Catherine the person. It was to the power she represented, and her power had become radioactive in that instant. The rest of the auditorium was a sea of frantic activity. I saw journalists, previously relaxed in their seats, now typing furiously on their laptops, their faces lit with a predatory excitement. The scent of a monumental scandal was in the air, and they were sharks that had smelled blood in the water. More importantly to me, I saw the employees, managers, analysts, people who had worked with me for years, who had watched me wither under Catherine's weight, but had remained silent. Their faces were a complex canvas of emotions. There was shock, yes, but there was also an unmistakable glint of validation, a late and startled recognition. Perhaps they had seen the small abuses, the subtle lies, the way Catherine appropriated ideas, but those were just disconnected dots. Now, the entire picture was painted for them, in vivid, terrible colors, and in their eyes, I saw the truth of my story finally being accepted, and I, in my hotel room, felt no euphoria. I didn't smile. There was no cry of victory caught in my throat. Instead, a single, hot tear rolled down my face. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of joy. It was a tear of relief, the tear of an unimaginable weight finally being lifted from my shoulders. The validation I had so desperately sought for years, the approval I had silently begged for from Catherine, I was receiving it now. Not from her, but from the truth itself. Emotional justice didn't come with a thunderclap. It came with the heavy silence that followed the chaos. The moment when everyone in that auditorium, and soon the world, finally understood. The official broadcast was cut. The screen turned blue, with an apology for technical difficulties. But the final image, captured for a second by the camera before the cut, was seared into my mind. 2 security guards in suits walking onto the stage, not to contain the audience, but to approach Catherine. They said something to her, and the woman who commanded an army of executives with a snap of her fingers followed them backstage like an automaton. Her body was there, but her soul, her persona, had died on that stage. Her white suit now looked like the shroud of her career. The queen had been deposed from her throne, live, for her entire kingdom to witness. Alone in the silence of my room, the echo of the chaos still reverberating in my mind, I did the last thing that needed to be done. I moved my mouse cursor to the control panel of my website. Project Truth, the murder weapon, the proof of my innocence, the key to my salvation. It had already served its purpose. The truth was no longer imprisoned there. It was loose in the world, uncontrollable, alive, multiplying with every share, every news story, every conversation. There was a red button in the corner of the panel that I had carefully programmed. Permanently delete everything. I pressed it without the slightest hesitation. A dialog box appeared. A final safeguard. Are you sure? This action is irreversible. I looked at the view of the brick alley from the window. The afternoon sun hit the tops of the buildings. I was no longer a spy. I was no longer a vigilante. The weight of that mission, which had consumed me for months, had simply vanished. I was finally free. I took a deep breath, the first truly free breath in years, and clicked yes. In the shocked silence of their world, my version of the story no longer needed a guardian. It now belonged to everyone. 2 weeks have passed since the day of the convention. 2 weeks in which the world I knew was turned upside down, set on fire, and rebuilt from the ashes. The newspapers, the news portals, the corporate world podcasts, they all told the story, each with its own veneer of sensationalism and its search for the most shocking angle. The fallen angel, the betrayal that toppled the country's most powerful CEO. Behind the scenes of a corporate revenge, I was painted as a Machiavellian spy by some, as a tragic hero by others. But I didn't follow any of it. I turned off my phone, ignored the dozens of calls from unknown numbers, and shut myself off from the noise. My personal war had ended the moment I clicked delete. What came after was the world's spectacle, and my real job now was to deal with the silence that remained. In that silence, the first thing I had to do was face myself without filters. People called me many things: vengeful, treacherous, unethical, the villain of the story. And I had to admit, in the quiet of my apartment, that they weren't entirely wrong. I used espionage. I used secrecy. I used technology to create a trap. I delivered a fatal, calculated, and public blow to destroy a person's career and reputation. There is no heroic name for that set of actions. And the first lesson I learned, the most fundamental one, was this. I became the villain they needed me to be, because for too long, I had tried desperately to be the hero I thought I should be. The hero has no boundaries. She endures everything. She sacrifices herself. She never says no. I was that hero. I saw my ability to absorb Catherine's abuse, exploitation, and dishonesty as a badge of honor, a sign of my strength and loyalty. But it wasn't strength, it was a disease. Catherine didn't just exploit my lack of boundaries. She fed on it like a parasite. My energy was her fuel. My dedication was the raw material for her success. My final destruction, the act of being turned into a scapegoat, was the inevitable result of my never having built my own fences. The villain was born the exact instant I, for the first time, said enough. And my first wall wasn't built to attack Catherine, but to protect what little was left of my inner territory. The second lesson, the most painful to swallow, was about self-worth. For 10 years, I measured my value through Catherine's eyes. A compliment from her was the sun that lit up my week. A subtle criticism threw me into a winter of self-doubt. I was a mirror that only reflected the image she wanted to see. The act of exposing Catherine, therefore, was about much more than exposing her crimes. It was the act of shattering that mirror. It was my declaration of emotional independence. It was telling the universe, and especially myself, that my worth was not a performance bonus to be granted by a superior. It was mine, intrinsic, non-negotiable. The cost of this was enormous. I lost my career, my initial reputation, the false security of that world, but in return, I found myself, and I realized, with a shock, that the woman I found in the ruins was infinitely more valuable than the exemplary employee I had lost. And finally, I learned about the strange, alchemical power that is born from pain. The humiliation I felt in that auditorium, the despair on the day of my firing, they were the darkest, loneliest moments of my life, but they were also the raw material for my liberation. They say the fire that burns the forest also clears the ground and allows new seeds, dormant beneath the earth, to finally sprout. The pain emptied me. It emptied me of naivety, of the need to please, of the hope that the system was fair, and in that emptiness, something new finally had room to grow, a strength I didn't know I possessed. A quiet, strategic strength that doesn't need applause or validation to exist. No, I don't regret it. I would do it all again, every calculated step, every sleepless night, but I recognize the cost. A part of me, the part that believed in the inherent goodness of people, in meritocracy, in justice that comes from above, died forever. I became more skeptical, harder, perhaps sadder. The peace I have found is not the sunny peace of innocence. It is the gray, weary peace of a soldier who has survived a war she did not start. And this new woman, forged in fire and baptized in betrayal, now had to face the world she had, in a way, helped create. A world without Catherine in charge. A world where my name was at once infamous, and to a silent few, inspiring. The war was over, but its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Catherine's fall was not silent. It was a public, brutal, and, by corporate standards, remarkably swift spectacle. The recording was irrefutable, the dossier, flawless. The Althea Group, the client she had used as a pawn in her dangerous game, was the first to attack, with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for fraud and breach of trust. The company itself, in a desperate attempt to save its own skin and appease shareholders, filed a lawsuit against her for breach of contract and willful misconduct. Her assets were frozen. Her allies on the board of directors vanished like smoke in the wind. The woman who was the sun of the corporate universe became a black hole, sucking in everything she had once called her own. The last I heard of her was a discreet note in a newspaper. She had moved to the countryside, far from the spotlights that were once her oxygen. She didn't go to jail. The justice of the wealthy rarely ends there, but she was sentenced to something that, for her, was worse than prison: irrelevance. The empire that supported her also trembled. The CEO who fired me with a look of contempt and a speech about integrity, he was forced into early retirement 2 weeks after the scandal, a necessary sacrifice to calm the market. Other directors who were part of Catherine's inner circle were quietly reassigned or resigned. The storm I had summoned didn't just topple the queen, it cleansed the entire court. And Ben, the helpful, underestimated IT guy who forgot to revoke my access. In the restructuring that followed, With new leadership focused on transparency, he was promoted to head of data security. Apparently, the new management valued loyalty to ethics, not to tyrants. It was a small but incredibly satisfying note of poetic justice. And what about me? The hero? The villain? The truth is, I was neither. The world is not a fairy tale. I didn't get an offer to return to my old job in a parade of honor. My name had become too controversial. To many, I was the vigilante. To others, I was the employee who broke the golden rule of the corporate world. Blind loyalty. I was a risk, a symbol of rebellion. And no one wants a symbol of rebellion on their payroll. But I didn't want to go back. Returning to that world would be like a freed prisoner asking to be put back in their cell. The company, panicked to contain the scandal and avoid a lawsuit from me that would be even more devastating to their image, offered me a deal, a very generous financial settlement, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement that was a true work of legal art. They bought my silence on the sordid details that hadn't been made public. And I accepted. It wasn't a prize, but reparations, the payment for 10 years of my life, my mental health, my creativity. I used the money to do two things. The first was to take a year off, travel to places where no one knew my name, and relearn how to breathe. The second was to invest in myself. I didn't build a new empire. Catherine's boundless ambition had cured me of my own. Instead, I started a small consulting firm, Ethos Strategic. We help other companies build crisis protocols and management systems based on transparency. We teach people how to build castles on the rock of truth, not on the quicksand of lies. My office isn't at the top of a skyscraper with a panoramic view of the city. It's a smaller office, in an older building, but with huge windows that let the sunlight stream in all day. There are no sycophants in the hallway, and the only coffee I drink is the one I brew myself. And on my desk, next to the computer, and a pot with a plant I make sure to water every day, there is a single rule written in a silver picture frame. It's not a quote from a business guru. It's the lesson I learned in the fire. The sentence reads, "Truth isn't a strategy. It's the starting point." Catherine taught me, in the most brutal way possible, what happens when you lose yourself in the pursuit of power. I chose a different path. I found power by finding myself, and that is a victory that no one, ever again, can take from me. This victory, however, came with a price, and it came with a label, that of a villain. And that is why, now, I turn to you, my final jury. You have heard my version of events. The version that wasn't in the newspapers, that wasn't told in boardrooms decorated with awards for management and ethics. You saw the silent humiliation, the loyalty turned into a weapon against me, and the annihilation of a career planned coldly, like a contingency in a spreadsheet. You saw the house of cards that I, with my own hands, helped build, and then, with a single breath, brought tumbling down. The system offered me two exits, two single doors at the end of a dark hallway. Be a silent, crushed victim, forgotten by history, and labeled as unstable, or become the antagonist of their narrative so that I could, finally, tell my own truth. I will not lie to you. I violated Catherine's privacy. I used espionage to get the truth. I orchestrated a public, merciless, and humiliating attack. By the rules of the world we lived in, I broke every unwritten law of corporate ethics. I didn't play fair, but I ask you, what ethics exist in a system that protects charismatic predators and punishes the victims who dare to have a voice? What fair game is this, where one side of the board has all the golden pieces and the other doesn't even have the right to move? My loyalty was used to exploit me. My trust was used to frame me. When all the doors of formal justice are closed, when HR is an arm of management and leadership is blinded by its own arrogance, what is a cornered person left with? So, the final verdict is yours. Was what I did an act of revenge or a desperate act of survival? To expose a monster hiding in plain sight, is it justifiable to use the weapons of darkness? Was my action one of destruction or of disinfection? Was I a necessary villain? Leave your verdict here in the comments. I will read every single one, because your opinion matters. Catherine's story and mine have come to an end, but there are countless other versions, other truths, still living in the shadows, waiting for someone's courage or despair to be told. If you believe that every story has more than one side, and that sometimes the most important version is the one they tried to erase, subscribe to the channel, because the next trial is about to begin.